City of Perth, in world different than Earth.
Welcome to... This actually isn't a series yet. I guess this is kind of part of the stain on his hide. Welcome to Zealots of Birbio. This episode we're going to be talking about the stain on his hide and giving a super summary of it. Pretty much the most important things from each chapter and episode. Just going up from chapters 1 to 3, which is what has been released so far, so that you can kind of jump into it for chapter 4 and kind of really get into it if you need to. Ideally, you would listen to all of it going up there. Like, it is a better experience to listen to it all, but if you do feel discluded and you want to listen to the new stuff when it comes out next week, just feel free to watch this summary. There will be some spoilers, but at the same time, nothing huge. If I do one of these summaries for the rest of the season, there will be a lot of spoilers because it gets really intense and a lot of plot stuff happens. So that will be a little different, but for chapters 1 to 3, there shouldn't be too many spoilers, and if they are spoilers, you can still go back and listen, and it should still be interesting. A lot of the role-playing and interesting story things are still there. This is just an overall plot synopsis. Episode 1, Chapter 1. That's opposite. Chapter 1, Episode 1. Screams in the Wood. So in this episode, both of the players meet. So a short monk named Sin Jiang, and an artist named Periete meet at the tree called the King of Limbs and find a mysterious note and decide to follow it for their own reasons, which will be revealed later. So they went into a scary forest and decided to follow some screams that they heard. They ended up saving a lady from some tribal cultists that chased them and almost killed them. And then Periete used some magic to escape, and Xinjiang ran on tops of the trees. And yeah, they went and found the small village of Windwell. That was all Screams of the Wood. So then Ethereal Places is Chapter 1, Episode 2. They proceeded to safely exit the forest through Windwell after stopping at Jane's house a little bit, and there's a little bit of a role-playing moment there where Periete saw some art from some people in his backstory, I guess I'll say that. And he had some disdain for it and kind of respected Jane a little less. Jane was the lady that they saved. And so after going there, they walked along to the tower, said their farewells to Jane at the Springs, which is a sector within Perth, which is the city in which this takes place. So they continued on, found the Tower of Hermiton, of which their letter led them to, and they found that it was completely desolate. All of the hermits that normally live there just completely left. And so they got really curious, they got really worried, and Sin kind of first revealed that he was part of this group called the Brethren. And then Periete soon revealed after that he was also part of a group, and that's why they were on this quest. And so that kind of linked them together and brought them together in their quest. And so they continued to follow this mysterious note that they found. And they ended up walking up and down the hills of Hermiton until they found a robed man in white. And he was just meditating there. And so after Sin kind of found out he was like meditating and he couldn't really stop him from meditating, Sin and Periete just meditated with him, and they found themselves somehow in this very magical place and magical situation. They found themselves in a strange dimension called the Aether, which is like a mental dimension, and they got there through meditation. And so pretty much this guy that was meditating on the hill in the Aether gave them more of their quest, said in order to save the world, you have to keep the current leader in power, and things have to, it's like, there's a weird like fate and time quest kind of thing. And so after that, they exited, and the man had disappeared. He had completely faded. He fell off the cliff in the dream, and then they slept under the stars and had like a very tranquil and meaningful rest after all of this went down. So now, starting with Chapter 1, Episode 3, Two Lights. So Two Lights, or The Two Lights, is probably the most intense episode in the campaign thus far. So they get back to civilization in the morning. They bought some berries from a god and sold some art. And then Periete visited a tavern to learn some stuff about the hermits who left. And the monk went out to search for trouble, and he found it. He ended up chasing a criminal through the streets and found out that this is actually one of the most notorious supervillains in the place, and he got stabbed and nearly died. But luckily, since the monk, Sin Jiang, is a follower of Iera, some of Iera's followers, Iera's angels, saved him and brought him to their haven. So then Periete went on a nervous search, looking for Sin Jiang. Couldn't find him. He started to get worried, and then he especially actually got worried when one of the followers of Iera pointed him in the direction of Iera's haven, saying, "Oh yeah, your friend is there." He's like, "What? Did they kidnap him? What's going on?" And so he went down. A guy named Cesario Milton on a horse in the middle of the city kind of brought him there, and he's a very flamboyant figure. And then so when Periete got to Iera's haven, he kind of barged in and tried to find Sin Jiang, but the followers, the religious people, were very peaceful and kind of just pushed him away and were like, "It'll all be fine." And then he just took a walk. And I think that's where that episode ended. Chapter 1, Episode 4, An Unlikely Impetus. So Periete defiled the art of his enemy, used some magic to do that. That was an interesting scene. And then he met up with the now awake monk, and they talked to a powerful dude from earlier, named Cesario Milton, who's actually trying to find people to take his place, because he's a leader in Zakar. So being the counselor in Zakar, he kind of had the power to just bestow this power upon people, and he kind of sold it. And so those two, Periete and Sin Jiang, kind of took it upon themselves, and then a third person, Nate, a giant in heavy armor, decided to also take it for his own personal reasons. And so the three of them quickly became somewhat powerful, being new co-counselors of the Zakar sector in Perth. So Cesario Milton kind of showed them the ropes a little bit, just showed them where they can sleep in the Citadel, and showed them all this stuff, and then he kind of left. And right away, when the Emperor came down, because this is a dynastic system in this place, Nate didn't want to bow, and he just made a scene, and he ended up throwing durian fruit at an important person, and ended up fighting verbally a little bit with Emperor Geoff. And that was where we ended it. Now, it was all kind of building to this. Chapter 1, Episode 5. Brawn and Brawl. After that all cooled down, all the three players just kind of went and did their own things, starting out as leaders. And so Nate started to raise an army to help the military because the foreign military was lacking. And Sin began to walk a giant guy named Bob, and took him to a tavern. And then Periete made a mural on the Citadel wall because there were some people doing graffiti, and then he just joined them and kind of took over for them and tried to teach them, but they just were like really awkward. And then so Nate got to the tavern at some point after training his army a little bit. And at the tavern, there were some people who were bad-mouthing homeless people, which they called hobes. And Nate really took offense to this because of things in his backstory, and so he kind of picked a fight with them, and it didn't go well. They ended up leaving, and he thought they were a coward, and so he went to them, but then he found that they had this little gang called the Syndro Boys, and so him and Sin actually joined to help Nate, but didn't really fight because he's a pacifist for the most part. That was kind of interesting. And then Periete joined, and so it was the three of them against this whole like horde of guys who were like tough guys, and they ended up beating them. And then Nate kind of crowned himself king of the peasants, or like he just kind of got positive reputation with all of the peons in the audience. And then after that, yeah, that was the end of Chapter 1. Now moving on, Chapter 2, Episode 1, Scholars of the Realm. So Periete wandered into the Wild Sector, which is a place for insane people, and he met a person named Madovich Lusky, who actually once was a counselor of Zakar. And Madovich is a little bit of a shifty character, but they got along somewhat well. But during their conversation, Periete smelled fire, and he left to deal with this building that was burning down. And at this time, Nate was training an army, and Sin was meditating to try to connect to his deity, because after the fight in last episode, Sin kind of had a moral dilemma of, is it alright to help out a friend in a fight, or like what boundaries is pacifism, and like, yeah, so he was kind of asking his deity about that. He wasn't really getting answers in his meditation, he's getting impatient. And then Sin came to a conclusion that he didn't really want to come to, and it was very abstract. It was very cool to see that. I definitely watched that episode just for that. And yeah, that's about all that happened in that episode. It was a relatively uneventful episode, but it was all building towards the next episode, which is Chapter 2, episode 2. And this episode is called Going Wild, with an E because that's how the Wild Spectre... With an E because that's how the Wild's Scepter... Episode is called Going Wild because it takes place in the Wild Sector. And then there's a semicolon, Fire in the West. In this episode, Nate's recruiting and training is going well, but he has some mild trouble with the owner of the warehouse in which he's kind of building his army. And so he has to go and kind of talk to the owner of the warehouse, just some diplomatic stuff. Meanwhile, Periete found the burning building, ran in to help, and saw a person with a zombie-like disease. And so he just kind of panicked and then blew the whole place up with his magic. And just kind of like, it was already burning down, he just destroyed it more with fire. And he kind of lost a little bit of his sanity there and kind of started down a little bit of a dark path. And he ran away from the scene, and Sin passed him on the way, coming there after hearing the explosion. And then Nate was talking, and he wasn't really coming to a good deal with this person, because Nate didn't really want to give anything up, and this person needed something, obviously, for his warehouse. And the conversation was cut short by this sound of explosion nearby, because these sectors are right next to each other. And so Sin and Nate arrived at the scene. Nate brought some of his top men, and then they began to try to save people, and they had this mission to try to see what happened. And meanwhile, Periete fretted with paint messily in his room at the Citadel, and kind of just spilled a bunch of black paint everywhere, and then he just ran away. And so Nate and some of his men actually saved a person, and as they did so, Matovich from earlier exposed Periete. He kind of just was vague about it and let them fill in the dots, and it was kind of sketchy, and he was like, maybe I should take his place. Maybe he's not in the right mental place. And so yeah, there was a little bit of that, and then they just rejected him. So, next episode, Chapter 2, Episode 3, is The Darkening Within. So this episode revolves very, very heavily around the spiritual battle going on within Periete. And so Periete felt the internal after effects of his actions and began to fall into insanity and worship, not really worship, but just kind of fell to an evil god, Zeth, the Cold One. And he left his place in a mess of black paint, and then Sin returned knowing something was off after seeing Periete's expression earlier when they passed. And Sin pretty much sees the room and uses his like magic of Iera, which is kind of the positive side, the opposite of Zeth, and just kind of heals the room, does like a little bit of an exorcism on the room, and removes all the evil from it. All of this went right over Nate's head, as tall as he was. And while Sin and Nate were investigating, Periete returned with a quest to kill some bandits in the north. That was where it ended. After that, we have our episode 3, chapter 1. Completely wrong. After that, we have our chapter 3, episode 1, which is Exorcism, and it's quite self-explanatory. Pretty much, Sin goes through a lot of abstract nonsense to exorcise Periete of Evil God's power, and he does so correctly. That's the essence of all that happens. There's some background set up and that kind of thing, but that's the main plot point. Chapter 3, episode 2, Battle of Forest and Wind. The three of them went to the place in the north, Old Perth, which was said to be plagued with bandits, and they found the cultists that they ran away from in the first episode. This time, they actually fought rather than running, and with the help of another army that came in spontaneously on the same quest as them, they took out all the cultists. And it was a relatively intense fight, and there was some like manipulation magic and some weird things going on during the fight, but yeah, they got through. Chapter 3, episode 3, Thrown to the Wolves. This is an intense episode. So the people that helped out are the Winterwind Whites, and these people, sure, they helped them fight the cultists, but they also have extreme views against any sorcery, which is magic cast not from a god, and Periete doesn't follow a god, and so they made sure to ask, it's like, which god do you all follow, because that's a big thing in their creed. And when Periete was vague and said, I follow nature, or I get my magic through the beauty of life, they were like, okay, so Korlak? And he was like, no. And they were like, okay, this is a problem. You should come with us. And so they ended up bringing him, and they got him tested with a guy named Borojin. And Borojin, pretty much in meditation, which was like forced meditation in the spirit realm, he pretty much made certain that Periete does not follow a god. and then he pretty much sent Periete to his death. And so there was this intense walk going down, and all this setup, and then he was going to be sacrificed to this beast called the Grimhound, or the Yuk-Kale, and it ended up being Bob, the Yuk-Kale. There was no Yuk-Kale, it's all just myth, lore. That's the big thing with Korlak, is that it doesn't really exist, it's all just folk tales. And so they thought it was because they never got a good look at Bob, who got lost, because Periete, at the end of season 1, just let Bob go when he went to the fight, and so Bob just went wandering, and he's really dumb, so he just got lost. And so after that, Bob kind of fought a bunch of cultists that randomly attacked, because the cultists from earlier were like seeking revenge or something. And so these cultists attacked, and so there was this huge battle, and that's chapter 3, episode 4, A Chaos of 4 Winds. In this episode, there is a really intense fight with many sides. So there's Periete that's breaking himself free using magic. There's Xinjiang, who's trying to help Periete, but also just trying to survive. And then when the cultists come in, he actually started like murdering them and getting really intense, as he did actually earlier. And then partway through the battle, Nate came in and fought the leader of the Winterwind Whites, or at least that group of the Winterwind Whites, and slayed him in this epic duel. They finished off a bunch of the cultists and the Winterwind Whites, and there's just this chaos. And after that, everything just settled. And that's where we've left off. Now, I hope this has been a productive summary for you. I hope you kind of understand the story a little bit more. And since this is quite vague, maybe it'll bring your interest into some of the later episodes. Maybe it'll make you want to listen to the podcast. If not, I hope you enjoyed this video nonetheless. And stay tuned for more Staying in His Hide videos. Farewell.